Welcome back, everyone, to our Speakeasy. I'm back again with Andrew Liddell of the Courier and Susan Dalgetty of the Scotsman.
Right.
Both of them authors, both of them bestsellers. In the case, one of them is just a book selling like hotcakes. The Women Who Won't Be Wished are in demand, which I suppose means I should start with some good news Monday. Since it's a Monday we're recording this, let's start with some good news. First piece of good news that I saw today in Bloomberg, the United Kingdom has officially overtaken France to become Europe's largest stock exchange.
Ooh.
So that's nice. I immediately wondered if that was to do with political instability on the continent with France, whereas Britain, curiously, and we're going to talk about this, will have quite a great deal of political stability, it seems, after this election. Second, Tony Blair has come out in the Telegraph, of all places I saw.
No, Holyrood.
And was it Holyrood originally? Was it Mandy?
Yeah, absolutely. Great interview.
And he was defending single-sex spaces for women and was able to define what a biological woman is. Now, it's kind of sad that we're chalking that up as great deal. That's great political courage, but it is where we are, and it's good news. And we all, I think, the Labour leadership do listen to Tony Blair a lot more than is publicly admitted. I think there's a lot of Blairiness going on, influence-wise, with Starmer, so it's interesting to see Blair poke his nose up every now and then. He has been interesting, because I remember 2 years ago he came out with quite a lot through his own institute about the left should avoid culture wars, which people was not listened to at the time. But yeah, so good news Monday. We now know what Blair thinks about what a woman is, and we also have the largest stock exchange in Europe. Happy days. So, I think today we're going to be really talking about the election. I don't think there's a lot else. If there is some other topic, feel free to raise it, of course. I don't mind. But I think we need to start with what. We'll come back to the Scotland specifics later, but just at a UK-wide level, the Great Conservative Party, this party in its current form, 200 years? Before that, you can go back with the Tories to the 17th century. I mean, you're talking almost 600 years of political tradition. And you can see it absolutely crumbling around us in a way which does make me think of, what happened to liberal England in the 1920s. It really frighteningly has those echoes. I remember I wrote a couple of pieces about this on my Substack, not with Think Scotland yet, but I've been working through what comes next. If the Tories do end up with 90 or 120 MPs, and you get 5 Reform MPs there, including Farage, is this a Canada-style realignment? Is this the end of that English small C Conservative tradition that goes back to Sir John Fortescue, through Burke and all of that, Bishop Aylmer? Is it just the end of that? And instead you're seeing a sort of tawdry Faragian populism? Just like Canada, we saw that reform. What do you think, guys?
Well, I think I'll jump in first. I mean, I think it's a really good comparison with the kind of death of, or indeed, that's obviously disputed, but what people would think of as the death of liberal England. And I think there's definitely shades of kind of 1922. And I mean, Boris Johnson and Lloyd George are kind of similar figures in a way. And I think if you look at, they both kind of won huge majorities in 1918 and then 2019 off the back of winning the First World War, getting Brexit done. But actually, after that, they don't really have a clear agenda, and the coalitions that they've built around those big events start to fall apart. So I think that's quite an interesting comparison. I mean, in terms of will it happen and the consequences of it, I mean, I do think the first past the post system will obviously naturally help the Conservatives to keep seats where they're being challenged by reform. And I think that the Conservative Party, as you alluded to, Dean, has historically been very good at renewing and reinventing itself to kind of adapt and survive. It's a kind of a great Darwinian political force in that respect. So I think I'm a bit more sceptical possibly about whether it will be consumed by or become a kind of reform style party. But I definitely think the party is heading post Rishi for, I mean, clearly they're heading for a terrible election result, but then also I think there'll be, years, if not a decade of internal strife. I'm sure they'll elect some grim right winger to try and counteract Farage, and that will drive them, further into the electoral abyss. Would be my sense.
Susan?
Farage, I think what's happened to our politics, Andrew's a historian, so his take on the comparison between Lloyd George and Boris Johnson is more than likely very accurate. Though at least Lloyd George presided over the great liberal reforms and the kind of creation of the welfare state.
Yeah. Has a record he can look back on with some.
Boris Johnson has just presided over chaos.
Yeah.
I think that's what actually happened to our politics largely, that it is big personalities that people are drawn to rather than political parties. And because our political parties are quite hollowed out, there are not very many serious people at the leadership level of any of the parties. I don't just mean Starmer, though Starmer's quite serious. I mean a leadership team in every party. So politics has been hollowed out. So people will vote for Farage and for reform because Farage is a celebrity, the same way that Boris Johnson was a celebrity. So if, as predicted, the Tories end up with, 120 seats or whatever, I think Farage he'll be subsumed into the Conservative Party if he is an MP. I don't reform with 5 MPs. What can they do? Farage as a leading light in a new phase of the Tory party could do far more.
It's an interesting point now because it comes down back to what Andrew said, who becomes the leader. Because I noticed Badenoch has already came out and said Farage will never be in the same party as me, and she's a darling of the right. Whereas Suella Braverman says, "Oh no, we should unite." So you immediately see the fight there that's going to happen.
Yes, absolutely.
Farage, if he's in Parliament, chomping his cigar, floating around the Commons like Banquo's ghost, haunting the Conservatives. I don't know. It's a lot of Conservatives might be really unhappy that he's just utterly defenestrated them, and they might not be all that welcoming. I don't know. But then people tend to go where the power is, or who the popular figure is.
Yes.
I don't. It could be very interesting. The Tories could jump either way with Farage. I don't know.
But for the majority of people in Britain, the death throes or otherwise of the Conservative Party over the next 2 or 3 years are almost irrelevant, because what matters is, will Starmer and his team be able to fix the mess that 14 years of austerity plus external shocks like COVID have? I mean, our country is in a mess. It's good news about the stock exchange, but that's on the back of France imploding. So the world
swings roundabouts.
Western democracy seems to be, and look at America. Well, don't look at America. Western democracy is in a very fragile place at the moment, I think. Ironically, probably Britain's has the potential to be more stable than anywhere.
I have a theory about that, you know. I'll let you come in after you hear my theory, Andrew.
Yeah.
My theory is we've already drank the populist Kool-Aid and seen it didn't work. We've already went through this since 2014 with SNP, 2016 with Brexit, and we're kind of over it now. Whereas it's not went through the system yet in France or America. Maybe they just don't learn from America. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on. There's you could talk about tremendous income inequalities. America, there's a large isolationist, give up empire kind of thing. There's also money in politics. There's a lot sort of separate stuff in America. Whereas with Europe, I definitely think it's just people haven't experienced the failures of the populists yet, whereas we have. And that's why we're going back to center, as it were.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. I think as well, in the British press, certainly it all kind of gets bundled into one big block. But I think it is worth reminding people, of course, the kind of populists in Europe, the Melonis and the Le Pens, and they're not actually calling for a kind of Frexit, or they're not anti-European in the way that are the Faragists are, which I think is an important. I mean, they are anti-European. Don't get me wrong, but they're not calling for a kind of extreme measures like that. In fact, I think Le Pen now even isn't calling to leave the euro, and that I don't know. I'm not an expert on these things, but I think that's an interesting point. The only other thing I think just about the stability question is, for me, say reform does do well, and or the Tories kind of turn in themselves and either elect an incompetent or are beset by infighting, all of which I think is quite likely. I'm not sure actually that is necessary. I mean, that's clearly not actually that good for stability. I mean, I think, I would support Starmer. I think, I want him to be Prime Minister. But if he's given, and I think we saw this with Corbyn and Boris a bit, Corbyn was so ineffective. If a party has and a Prime Minister has totally free reign, really, and the opposition is basically non-existent, that actually creates problems of its own. And I think even for Starmer, who is clearly quite a kind of straight-laced, sensible, kind of the antithesis, I suppose, of Boris in many ways. He's a kind of you might not want to have a pint with him, but you definitely trust him to kind of look after your kids, type thing. I think even that it can lead to hubris, and it can create all kinds of problems if there's not proper scrutiny and not proper debate. So just a word of caution on that, I think.
Yeah, the instability will then come from within the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Because the opposition, while the Tories are destroying themselves, fighting over whether it's Kemi Badenoch or Suella Braverman who takes them forward, that leaves the Labour Party to be its own opposition if they have a huge number of MPs. And I think I've said this before. I think if there is a significant increase in the number of Scottish MPs, that will have a knock-on effect on Scottish politics.
Yeah.
That I don't think we've quite worked through what that will mean yet, but it will be fascinating. But it is, I think, we boil it back down to, people's everyday concerns. People are looking for stability. Starmer his public persona is very boring. Apparently he's actually quite a good chap to go for a pint with, as long as you like football.
Yeah.
And he is a bit of a control freak, but perhaps that's what we need at the moment. I still think that what we miss is the kind of overall narrative. What kind of country is he trying to achieve? I know that wealth creation and growth, absolutely, because you can't support quality public services without, a strong economy. But he has yet to paint the picture of what this wealth creation is for. What kind of country? Stable, yes, but we need more than stability. stable.
You're not a fan of strong and stable, if for those.
No.
But you immediately remind me. Post 1997, you had Labour being its own internal opposition, but it could be even worse this time round if still not yet to happen. But if Labour do end up with 400 plus MPs or something crazy, there's a limit to how many MPs can be put on the payroll.
Absolutely.
So you're going to have a lot of MPs who will know they'll never be on the payroll. They'll never get to where they think they deserve to go in terms of ministerial office. So you're going to have a lot of people winning that the Labour Party did not think would win and don't really know who the heck they are. You might have a couple of crate nutters. We've all seen it before.
The only thing I'd say, Dean, about that is I think that they have. I mean, my understanding is that Starmer's team, as in the sort of the backroom team rather than the shadow cabinet, have been quite hot on trying to have a more centralised approach to selections, and particularly trying to make sure that kind of lunatics and unreliables are not in positions to get elected. And I think they've been quite effective in doing that. I mean, I think you're still right that, will that last after 18 months and people are being turned down for positions they think they should get and all this kind of thing is a slightly different question. But I think in general, the candidates who have been selected are sort of considered to be Starmer loyalists and kind of on board with the project.
I do remember that. Yeah, you're right. They did get rid of a couple of the more exotic ones. They made sure they were deselected, which I've been cheering to the rafters. I did enjoy the sort of Corbynite malmentum wing of the party decrying and saying, "Oh, it's Stalinite purges," and it's the grown-ups are back in charge and we're not tolerating the nonsense anymore. But then I've always taken the Alan Johnson view of I want malmentum out of the party. I've always taken that view, and that's that. But yeah, so I think Labour in office, going for growth, terrible economic inheritance, and all in all. So taxes 70-year high, not a lot of juice left in the offering to try and raise taxes further. So the first couple of years are probably going to be really thankless for Labour. They're not going to be able to do very much. So there's not going to be this sudden change, which will count. And at the same time, you will have an opposition. It could be Tory, Reform, whatever it is, competing on who can hold the government to account the loudest. I suppose the spectre then becomes immigration, and I think this is going to be where Farage and the Tories more broadly indeed will probably go in the long term. Immigration and the ECHR will be the new Brexit, the new other that we'll blame everything on. And Labour are going, sure, signs of optimism. What, net immigration 700,000 or whatever it is right now. 102 once in a century events have happened. The Ukraine thing and Hong Kong. So they're not repeatable. The immigration will come down anyway. But you're still going to talk about 300, 400,000 net. It's still going to be a big political issue, and Labour don't really want to talk about it. And they're going to have to talk about it once they're in government. Day one, end Rwanda policy, fine. I think it's a bad policy. It won't work anyway. And then do what? Labour are going to have to talk about immigration, law and order, a lot of political issues that traditionally the party does not like to go near. Maybe a big majority will help Starmer be able to just do stuff that might not go down well with his own base.
Yeah, but if he has a big majority and he's a determined man, a determined leader, lacks personal charisma, but he's clearly quite determined, then he will have thought through what he should do about immigration, illegal immigration, rather than managed migration, which is important in all countries. So I think he will have thought it through. And his background as a human rights lawyer, which I see the Tories are now going to, this week their plan is to start attacking him personally, and his record on as a human rights lawyer is one of the issues, one of the things they're going to use against him. But he's a very rounded person when it comes to his hinterland. He's done things, everything from the work he did in Northern Ireland to his defence of young men in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean on death row. He is a serious human being, so he will have thought this through, and there will be time, the first couple of years, there will be time to at least start to put in place carefully put together measures on how to manage illegal immigration. Rwanda was just madness. It was just stupid.
I think that's right, Susan. I think exactly that point. I think that actually we shouldn't underestimate as well just having kind of sensible and respectable, I think, is a useful word. Having those kind of people in office, I think will make a big difference just in terms of the relationship with the French, for instance, and how they're managing, you know, and it's not a kind of confrontational thing of we're trying to get headlines in the Daily Express. It's you know, constructive discussion about how can we actually deal with these things collectively. So I think that shift in tone as well and shift in personnel will be quite important to tackling some of these, you know, particularly the illegal migration issue.
Depending on who the French government is, of course. Because if you have the Le Toy boy and as prime minister, and then Le Pen as president, I don't know what kind of relationship a Labour government could have. Respect.
I mean, that is as much as Starmer is a control freak, and he still has to manage the civil service, because the civil service has been hollowed out and over the last few years and been led by, to be blunt, people who didn't know how to lead. So there's a lot of work needed to build that back up again, which I presume Sue Gray will be advising on. But events, as Starmer can have them, was carefully planned 1 year, 2 year program, but it's events that will test him as a leader. Even more than, you know, fixing public services. So what happens in France, what happens in America in November is a huge big thing, because if Trump wins, then the geopolitics of the world is upended.
I did a big Substack piece a couple of weeks ago because I got curious about what's actually being said. What do Americans actually think? And I went through the polling, and I went through a lot of what Frank Luntz does. For those who don't know, Frank Luntz is one of the top, most serious psychologists out there. And he's also, incidentally, if you go back far enough, he was there in Canada with reform, and even further, he was also there with reinventing the language around the inheritance tax in America to death tax. So he's in his later years, he's went through a sort of mea culpa about some of the forces he definitely unleashed or helped to with his media of operations. But I was looking at his stuff, and he not only, I think it's understated how divided America is. I looked at some of the polling and the analysis he did was he asked parents, Republican parents and Democrat parents, how would you feel if your son married a voter from the other party? The anger that idea of that caused was quite profound. Really? And I was shocked at that. Yes. And it goes very deep. But more importantly, I think in America, two things. And you're seeing the Trump campaign already hammer this. Even Trump is all over the place and on messaging as he is, still lands these points because they're really low hanging at this point. Do you feel safer now than you did in 2019? Do you feel richer now than you did in 2019? No, then vote Trump. That's what they're going to do. And Biden's underwater on the economy, on immigration, on right track, wrong track, and he's really underwater on the polling. It's kind of serious. And if you look at real politics trackers, I mean, it's absolutely. I think that Trump will win more Latino men than the Democrats do this year.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
I think Latinos are gone. I think in the next 10 years for the Democrat. I think on culture. I think this whole Latinx thing, don't underplay how blood boiling that kind of identity politics lingo is. I mean, it really infuriates communities because, of course, Latino is unhelpful because you've got Venezuelan Americans, Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans. It's actually not the same thing whatsoever. But they do tend to be more socially conservative on culture. Which the Republicans have finally noticed after 50 years. So on America, it's actually, and it's unhelpful that the trial that he was found guilty of is the one in New York, because that's been priced in a long time ago. And it kind of cuts to his favor, because I listened to a Bulwark podcast where they do the focus groups. And I was listening to what the Trump Republican voters say. They see Trump as the moderate on culture in a really bizarre kind of inverted reality. They look at Pence and they look at these Republicans and think, oh, they're like real Bible thumping. Trump, yeah, he's had 3-4 wives. He has sex with porn stars. He doesn't really have any moral thinking on abortion one way or the other. He's actually seen as the moderate force, but for Republican voters, which is nuts, and it plays to his advantage. So this Stormy Daniels thing just doesn't hurt him with his voters at all, or with independents who are slightly more right-leaning. So it's nuts in America, like.
But then that nuts will be nuts on the world stage if he's back as leader of the free world.
And of course, Taiwan 2020. Yes. Taiwan 2027 is a date to keep an eye on. But
I definitely think that, I mean, foreign policy is going to be a real challenge for Keir. I mean, in a way that I think it probably hasn't been for, prime ministers, well, possibly even since the Iraq War. I mean, certainly it's, I think it's likely to come back in a way where it's going to have an impact in domestic politics, I suppose, is what I mean, and how he's viewed in a way that it probably hasn't for putting Brexit to one side, obviously not treating that as a foreign policy issue. But I think it'll be interesting how Labour. I think actually Keir will be quite good at that. Actually, I think he's got a gravitas and a good sense of how to navigate that. I mean, I think if you think of him and I don't know, world leaders, he kind of slots. He seems, to my mind, to slot right in.
Yeah.
That doesn't hold any concerns for me at all in how he conducts himself and how he builds relationships with people. But who could build a relationship with Trump? Because the man's crazy. So what my concern is that the geopolitics will become so unstable that he becomes a victim of events completely outside his control, and therefore and already you can see the impact of Macron's crazy gamble to go for an election on the French economy.
It feels a lot like Rishi Sunak's early election, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, not even crazier actually, because Sunak had to have an election by the end of the year. Macron, he was probably going to face a vote of no confidence in the autumn, but still, I mean,
he had a Jupiterian moment. It happens to Macron.
Just absolutely nuts. But my real concern is that Starmer and his team do their very best to stabilise the British economy, public services, just the whole culture of the country, but outside there's storm fires and
Does this all mean that we're going to have to he's going to have to reopen the unmentionable B word, Brexit, single market, renegotiate the backstop? Are they going to have to do this? If you want to do growth, there is this constant, very quiet whisper, closer economic ties with Europe, not rejoining Europe. That's off the table. Their party will never go near that. But there is the constant topic in conversation that it might be closer to the single market or single market adjacent? Are they? That's a big thing to start reopening.
I think he'll be much more subtle than that. I think in individual areas, I think him and his team will just be more open to having adult conversations with Europe. So that trade, because that's the big issue, isn't it? Trade becomes much easier than it is at the moment, because you're right, Europe is our huge market. We cannot function if trade is not smooth. You can't get growth.
Yeah, there is the added dynamic. I suppose we should be positive. We did join the CPTPP, which yes, it's not as big as the European single market now, but China's about to join it, Taiwan's about to join it. Once they join it, we will have, within the next 2 or 3 years, because we've just joined it, we will basically have a trade agreement with the biggest chunk of the world, Japan, South Korea, China. East Asia will be actually very good for British trade thanks to CPTPP membership. So that's a positive. I mean, there is a positive long term. I wonder what the dynamic that might have on a future relationship with Europe, because they're very different trade agreements. Because the CPTPP is regulatory competition, whereas the EU is regulatory alignment on standards. They're very, very different. So I don't know if one might affect the other. I'm not particularly a trade expert in that regard. But you did mention, Susan, who could have a relationship with Donald Trump? The late Shinzo Abe managed to pull it off, of course, in a very weird kind of way. He actually was able to charm Trump into being not negatively affecting Japan.
Yeah.
I think it was just ego stroke the ego.
Blamey, for example, is very, very close to Obama and the Democrats. I mean, he's a friend of Obama's, so no, I don't know anyone who to form a bond with Trump, you almost have to treat him like the king he thinks he is, or the emperor he thinks he is.
That's how you do it.
And I'm not sure that there's that's Starmer's style, but
no, I don't think he tolerates fools.
No, I don't.
Gladly. So, pivot now, I suppose, to Scotland specific.
Talking of Trump, yeah.
But the SNP, fair or not fair to say, Swinney has staunched the worst of the bleeding politically for them. There's a measure of they're not falling in the polls quite so much now. He sort of steadied the ship.
I think he's certainly cut a lot of the gaffes. I mean, I think Humza's premiership, was marked by kind of unforced errors, and I think Swinney's definitely delivered a level of professionalism in that respect. I think, though, has he turned the tide? I mean, my sense is actually no, really, because I don't think he's addressed the fundamental issues about why the SNP is losing support remain, and indeed perhaps to an extent are slightly accentuated, I think, by Swinney's leadership and as we were discussing last time, his record as a minister and that kind of thing. I mean, his competence actually isn't perhaps what the SNP would like to think it is. So I think my sense is he's restored a bit of, I suppose, the SNP's self-belief and their kind of self-confidence. But I don't think it hasn't addressed the kind of fundamental challenges they face, and I still think the result of the general election will not be kind.
No, I would agree with that. I think the SNP activists and party members are more comfortable now that he's in charge, because there's a grown-up, very dull, quite right-wing conservative grown-up, but there's a grown-up back in the room. But for the voters, for people, the health service is still in turmoil. The waiting lists are out of control. Our schools are largely a disaster. Our economic growth, people's mortgages, people's rents, the lack of affordable housing, all of those things remain. And while most people know that the SNP is devolved, those powers are devolved to the Scottish government. People still sometimes confuse the two governments, and I think people will vote Labour in much larger numbers because they want their health service fixed, even though the SNP government is responsible for their health service. So I think the mood music, I don't think Swinney's been able to do very much for the music in the country. I think it's the same. Apart from illegal immigration, I think, and even there, if you push people, their views, Scots' views on illegal immigration probably are less liberal than some commentators would like to think that we were as a nation. So I think
on that exact point, I remember, and I recommend people do it, if you go to Sir John Curtis's, the National Centre and all of that, they did big studies back in 2018, 2019 about this, and they found that where differences do exist, they're matters of mere degree on social issues, social attitudes between Scottish and English. And where there's a divergence, it's how the voters in Scotland see the issues and the parties lining up. It's nothing to do with being Scottish or English at all. So there's no national question. And on immigration perceptions like that, there's not really any difference.
No.
The commentariat in Edinburgh think that Scotland's, we're all Jock Thompson's bairns, bonny wee Scotland, but it's not really the country out there at large at all. It's not, they're not as enlightened as the commentariat would like them to be.
I think on that point, actually, Dean, I mean, if Farage and the Reform do well at the general election, I think we can expect a lot more of, oh, look at England, it's so different to us. Its values are different. They're all anti-immigration, whereas Scotland would never. So I think that will, and I don't know what impact that will have on the independence debate. My instinct would be not very much, but I think that will definitely become a conversation that I think, in particular, the Nats will try to push.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look how right-wing England's going.
Yes.
It's a thing, though. I mean, I don't know if that argument will cut through, because there was a Holyrood poll I saw 2 days ago that had Reform UK on 9 MSPs on the list.
Yes.
So I don't know if that actually will work or cut through. And 3 Alapa MSPs, which is more sign of further fragmentation with the SNP. So who knows?
I mean, I think I'm right in saying that more people in Scotland voted for Brexit than voted for the SNP in 2019.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's always, again, that's one of those, same as the sort of social attitude stuff. There's this perception of Scotland's this wonderful Remain heartland, and of course it is. I mean, a lot of people in Scotland did vote to stay in the EU, but there is a contingent that you would think that Reform might be able to play to in Scotland, and I actually think they would probably pull votes. I mean, obviously away from the Conservatives, but if it was elsewhere, it would be the SNP.
But absolutely.
Yeah, given its extraordinary coalition from kind of Patrick Harvey to Nigel Farage is the.
You see, Nigel Farage appeals to people the length and breadth of the UK. It's his personalities that he's got a twisted charisma. He is a celebrity. So when our politics focuses on individuals like that, then
I mean, people forget. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I've always thought, and I'm actually in the middle of writing a big, so heavily referenced and sourced piece for the Substack. At some point, I'll finish it, where I'm convinced that the SNP were the first populists, and there's a reason Farage never quite got it in Scotland, is because the market was already cornered by the SNP on the us virtuous people against them, the degenerate distant elite. The SNP just swapped Brussels for London. And Westminster, but it's exactly the same phenomenon.
Nationalism and populism,
hand in glove.
Two sides of the same coin. I think that's really good, and I think actually, if you think about Farage and Salmond, actually quite similar styles of politician, and I think yeah, you know, they're kind of, and I think you could see it actually. I don't know if you saw the clips on social media of when Salmon was going out to watch the football.
Yes.
And it was kind of with the, you know, that was, if substitute an England kit for a Scotland kit and put Farage in place of him, and it would be the exact same thing, you know, that ability to kind of be one of the boys and kind of, it's sort of popular stuff. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's you can't underestimate that as a political tool. It's quite powerful.
Oh yeah. Oh, actually, you're on form today, Andrew, with the comparisons between politicians. I'm quite enjoying it. And as I've been thinking, I mean, now that you compared Farage and Salmon, you reminded me when you compared Johnson and Lloyd George, and I'm actually quite taken with that. Actually, wasn't Lloyd George also kind of somewhat morally dissolute? Because was 1925. I mean, this is the reason we have the Honours Prevention Act. Was because of Lloyd George and his cash for honours. There is actually, now you mentioned, there's a certain.
That's right. I think we should stress Susan's point, which is a very good one, which is Lloyd George does have, you know, a considerable legislative record, which, you know, the basis of which we still enjoy today.
Yeah,
which is just not the case with Boris.
But anyway, so you made me think of it. Personality comparisons are always fun.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to ask. Yeah, on you go.
I was just going to ask about the turnout. There doesn't seem to be very much. I mean, I'm not out knocking doors, so this may be wrong, but there doesn't seem to be much enthusiasm for this election. In that, I mean, 1997, which was the last big, you know, shift, there was a kind of energy in the country that there is definitely. I mean, everybody's exhausted by the independence referendum, by Brexit, by COVID, by cost of living. People are just, they've had enough. So that might contribute to it. But I just wonder if the turnout is going to be lower than usual for a general election. I think
that's right, Susan. I think particularly, and I think that will particularly hurt the SNP, because I think that I think you're right in general. There isn't that kind of national excitement. I think people feel weary. I think it's also not been. I mean, Labour's obviously got such a large lead, and it's you know, the Roy Jenkins and Ming Barr's strategy of not, you know, trying to not wanting to damage that by doing anything dramatic. So yeah, there's a sort of lack of energy. I think that's a really good way to put it. But my instinct is that will hurt the SNP most, because I think it's their voters who will don't have a reason to turn out.
Yes.
And certainly, I think if there's a perception that, you know, you're, by voting SNP, you're kind of voting against a Labour government, and you're voting against change. That's not going to encourage people to leave their houses in this awful Scottish summer weather we're having. No. So, like, I think, so yeah, I think it would be much lower turnout, but I think that that will probably help Labour.
I think that's probably right.
What about voter ID? Voter ID. Well, that would probably count against the Tories in England, older voters. You know, we saw this with the local elections in England a while back, when they introduced the voter ID thinking it would hurt Labour, but it backfired and hurt them because their voters tend to be more elderly. They're used to not having ID. I wonder whether that will make things even worse for the Tories, and it will be entirely self-inflicted with voter ID.
Yeah, but your old age pension, whatever, your bus pass.
Would that do it?
That works. Yeah.
I don't know about bus pass.
And everybody under 22 is a bus pass. So, you know, the young voters as well will be able to use the bus pass. So the National Entitlement Card, which I think is its official title, will work at both ends of the age group, of the age. Oh. But when we were talking about the impact of the election result on the Tories, up here, of course, the interesting thing will be the election result on the SNP. Stable, lacks charisma, quite conservative in his approach, and then young Stephen Flynn, his head shining with excitement at the thought of becoming leader. And then, of course, Kate Forbes, though I don't think she's particularly comfortable as the deputy. So it will be interesting if there is a rout of the SNP, what then happens to the party internally.
Well, Kate Forbes has had a really rough. I'm beginning to question how good she is. I mean, with media appearances, she seems to not be very good at this. We saw when she first ran for the leadership, she put her foot right in her mouth with, volunteering opinions that she did not need to volunteer. And since she became deputy first minister, she's had a nightmare of a time.
I don't think she's been true to herself. If you're not true to yourself, I mean, God love Boris Johnson. He was a performer because he was true to himself, an absolute idiot who couldn't run a menage, but, he was Boris. And Starmer's true to himself. What you see is who he is. Kate Forbes is a social and an economic conservative, but she's toeing the party line and being the... I think she made a mistake taking that position on. But hey.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. What happens to the SNP after the election? Because I wrote about this a while ago, and I think I'm going to try and rekindle it in some way. But I think that if we have a situation which seems likely, which is that the SNP loses a lot of the seats it's held in the central belt, that's going to fundamentally shift, I think, the dynamic of the party that's grown over the last decade. And I think particularly with Swinney as leader, with Kate Forbes in a prominent position, even with Stephen Flynn and his kind of pro oil and gas stuff, that impacted it a bit. I think he's a slightly different style of politician, but are we starting to see a bit of the return possibly of the Tartan Tories? I mean, the membership's going to be different. The MPs and then potentially the MSPs, those views that are going to be coming through are going to be reflecting a totally different electorate to what's currently dominating the SNP's message. And I think that will be a really interesting and important shift in Scottish politics. Yep.
And then you have Labour again dominating the central belt. Exactly. This is what we said earlier, that Scotland is going to, the impact of the general election on Scotland is going to be quite significant.
Yeah, because far too many people have short memories, they forget. Alex Salmond in 2007, he talked about a Celtic tiger economy who can be just like Ireland, low tax, free market competition. It was a very the original SNP coalition that got them into power was not Glasgow social democracy and all of this Prince of cosplaying that Nicola Sturgeon's era did. It was far more 1990s, winning over the Tory rural shires of the northeast and things. That's how the SNP built themselves originally. And then they sort of pivoted slightly more to the centre to get in to replace Labour. And then they kind of marched off left with the independence referendum. The rhetoric shifted to a more left of centre to try and win those Labour voters over. But you're right, that's unspooling and it's sort of back to the future with the northeast will probably be the SNP's redout once again that they'll retreat to. I had thought the Tories might have held their seats up there. I'm no longer so sure because of Douglas Ross, which I couldn't believe that. I was because that was I mean, one, on the human level, how to treat a colleague was in the hospital. It was just terrible, on a sort of human level. I just thought it was appalling. Yeah, but it's also he's managed to convince the SNP to put their resources into a seat that, with boundary changes, etc., the Tories might have been able to win. And it's now the SNP went all in on this seat to stop Douglas Ross. So he's probably cost his party the chance of a pickup. If they were going to get anyone, that would have been one of the seats in Scotland. So I don't know what on earth Douglas Ross was thinking. And now he's now retired from the leadership, although he's retired. I don't think I've ever seen a party leader step down or announce they're stepping down in the middle of a general election.
No.
Whether it's the Scottish party or the UK party. I've never seen it before. I can't think of another example.
Yeah.
That's how bad it is.
I don't think there is. Yeah. I do think as well that it's indicative of how the SNP must think the election is going in the Central Belt, that they clearly decided that they need to get Douglas Ross to have something positive to say, because they're not going to be able to hold on to a lot of those seats. I think that's a recognition of that.
I think they know Glasgow's gone. The question is how much of the rest of the Central Belt goes with it. So they're looking to where can they pick. If you're SNP HQ, maybe we could pick up 5 seats from the Tories, or maybe 4 seats in offset. And there's a talking point that would spare John Swinney's blushes.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Labour people I speak to, I think privately, are the canvass returns and stuff are pretty good, even in places that have large SNP majorities or theoretical majorities. Yeah. So it could be a bloodbath, I think.
Susan, were you wanting to come in?
No, I was just agreeing.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, now there's a debate here, because people will say the Scottish opinion polls show the SNP might have significantly less than 20. Then you look at the MRP polling, and that would show the SNP might have like 28 or 32. I would just say the MRP is generally a very good model. It's very accurate polling. It's scientific regression and linear regression and all of this. It is very good, but always massive pinch of salt with individual seats with the MRP, because it is making seat by seat predictions. Some of those are really questionable in the Scotland modelling they're using, and we do know that their sample size in Scotland is not big enough.
I think that's right. Yeah, because and also I don't understand. They seem to get published, and no one with a political head seems to look at them and say, "Hold on, this is not." Labour winning Falkirk and not winning a single seat in Glasgow. It's just like
they make any sense.
This just can't be right.
Exactly, it's not. So I would just say when people are debating this, just Scotland, pinch of salt with the MRP. I don't trust their modelling on it, because you're seeing some really wacky predictions out of that. Stick with the Scotland polling, the one, and just add them all up. That's what I do. You're probably getting a more accurate picture. And also remember the tremendous regional variations. We've talked about this before. Northeast of Scotland, it's SNP Tory. Central Belt, SNP Labour. Most seats are SNP Labour. There are, in fact, there are 0 Labour or Tory seats in Scotland. There are none. And you do have regional pockets of Lib Dem appearing. And so who knows? I mean, Scotland's actually quite a complex map, is all I'm trying.
And I think Scottish voters also are, certainly in the last decade, have become very attuned to tactical voting and are, will it have been shown themselves willing to do that in the past. So I think that has an impact that's maybe difficult to predict as well.
Yeah. Across the UK, people are just quietly making up their minds on how to vote, and it will be tactical for most people.
And regarding the Green Party in Scotland, the Scottish Greens, allegedly, it is a mistake to assume that their voters, it's just the Green voters would switch to SNP necessarily. That's not clear to me on the numbers. There's plenty of Scottish Green voters who would probably vote Labour as a second.
Oh yes, the Robin Harper. I mean, Robin. In fact, the first, former leader and former MSP has just joined the Labour Party. So traditional, and I mean that in a very positive sense, members of or supporters of the Green Party who put climate emergency as their number one political priority. I think many of them will vote Labour, actually, because the Scottish Greens in Scotland, the Green Party in Scotland has become a parody of itself and has focused far more on identity politics than it has on climate. And their short period in government, neither Harvey nor Lorna Slater showed any ability of being able to translate environmental policies into and in fact quite the opposite. So I
Quite,
think
quite the opposite. I wrote a piece about land reform and the green lairds recently, because it does animate me. We're making land, not only are we making old landowners very rich with reforestation and on land which we're subsidizing and then letting them do carbon capture schemes with foreign companies. Not only are we basically subsidizing that without proper further land reform, at the same time, we're also just blasé about corporate interests, global corporate interests, with no connection to Scotland, just buying up the Highlands in a modern Highland clearance. You know, the largest landowner in Scotland is a Danish fashion billionaire. I mean, it's absolutely no connection to the land that he owns. It's people still have it in their heads that, oh, you know, the Duke of Buccleuch is still the largest landowner in Scotland. That's long since stopped being true. He sold the land to all these billionaires from all over the world who want to buy a Highland real estate, or big businesses like Brewdog, indeed, and Aviva, the insurance companies. And they're all buying up Scotland for carbon capture to sort of green their profile. And who are losing out? The communities that actually live on the land. Community ownership, you can't compete with the prices of the land now. I mean, because of the valuations went through the roof. And the Greens ought to have been able to, that should have been at the centre of a Green MSP.
Yeah, they forced out, you know, Scotland's leading expert on land reform, Andy Whiteman.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I can't believe it.
Yeah, so I don't think they will do very well. They may pick up some in, you know, places, some constituencies in Edinburgh, but I don't think the Scottish Greens will do particularly well in this election.
And to round up, I suppose, the UK-wide thing very quickly, Wales. I mean, I expect Labour to do well in Wales, they always do, but the Welsh Assembly, Labour have had a bit of trouble with the First Minister of Wales. That's an absolute mess. And I do wonder whether Welsh Labour are beginning to get to the point where Scottish Labour were before 2007, like in power for ages, somewhat politically moribund, and are just havering for a bruising politically. Complacency.
Yeah, I don't know that much about. I think obviously the Westminster, you know, the party's pretty confident. But I think it's an interesting question. I don't know very much about it. I mean, I've sort of seen the kind of headlines, but I must confess it's not.
Because I'm just thinking.
I'd be wary of commenting further than that.
Because I'm just remembering it wasn't that long ago where you had UKIP rollock home in the Welsh Assembly and with that, you know, weird blast from the past. What was his name? The former Tory MP. Sorry, former Tory MP who ended up.
Was it Neil Hamilton, wasn't it?
Neil Hamilton,
yeah.
He reappears in a second political life. And then you had Brexit Party as well. And these were all for Labour heartlands in Wales. You know, they also broke for Boris's Tories. There is unhappiness with traditional Labour Wales.
And populism.
Labour really need to be careful with it in Wales.
Populism attracts.
And
Labour
Welsh
Labour,
Welsh Labour shown a weakness, as I'm saying.
Reform will pick up votes in the red wall seats, just as
I looked at a poll. Apparently, I think this is why Farage is shifting to attacking Labour on his rhetoric now at the last stage. 20 seats would have Labour first, Reform second. 20.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, Stoke was the biggest Brexit city in the UK. You know, when people's lives are you know, under pressure.
Farage's big mistake. This is Farage is a populist on culture, but he's actually not a populist on economics at all. If he was a populist in economics, if he was a true thoroughgoing populist, he would have said NHS is brilliant, we need to protect our NHS, Labour will privatise it. That's how he would talk to red wall voters. Instead, he's went, oh no, let's talk about insurance and privatisation. Farage, people forget Farage, when it comes to economics, he is still the commodities trader. He's a Thatcherite. on economics, and he's very ideological, free market. So he's a populist on some things, culture, not on economics. He's actually an old-fashioned small government, low tax, free marketeer. So I wonder if his appeal is actually going to be quite limited to Labour's advantage there.
Thatcher's appeal, monetarist to our fingertips, wasn't limited for a decade. You know, people who traditional Labour voters, whatever a traditional Labour voter is, don't always vote on economic issues or cultural issues. I mean, people's. I just think Farage has got such a big personality that he will, because nobody knows what the Reform Party really stands for apart from as a vehicle for him.
It's of course not a party; it's a company.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so it's a vehicle for him, and it'll be interesting to see whether he needs to get elected, and if he is elected, how many other MPs that he brings with him.
It's the short money. One MP, 150,000 votes nationally. You've got short money. The Reform Party's here to stay. You know, it's not just Richard Tice bankrolling it. And that totally changes the dynamics because they won't go away if they get short money. And I think they'll get probably 3 MPs. They'll definitely get 15% of the vote. They'll get short money. They'll be able to finance themselves. That will attract private millionaire donors. At that point, the Reform Party really begins to get serious as an outfit. As right at the point when the Tories are really fighting for their breath. So I do think there's a danger of a political realignment on the right, which would be the death of small c conservative English tradition, which makes me rather sad, even though because it's a sort of constitutionalist phenomena. I mean, if you want to think about it, the English Civil War is a triumph of conservative England. It was, you know, the parliamentarians fighting to protect what Fortescue called the political and royal dominion of England against a king who wanted the French royal dominion. With, you know, it was a triumph of that English conservative tradition with the English Civil War. And it's a very proud tradition. It's constitutionalist, it's parliamentarian, it's a balance between conservative and liberal traditions with Burke. It's rather sad to see that disappear in the fires of a sort of American populism.
But those sensibilities won't disappear. So the Conservative Party has been the victim of, 15 years of really bad leaders and really bad politicians. I mean, I think that's the biggest issue across the whole of the UK is the quality of our politicians in all parts.
Surely it'll just get worse because the whole shift began with Cameron because of UK. That's not going to stop. So the more they go right, the more they fall away from their own tradition, and they lose the ability to look back and renew, which is what the Tories always used to be able to do. How many Tory MPs even know who John Fortescue was? Or Bishop?
Can I just finish on a couple of things that I want?
Sure.
Over the weekend, Michael Cashman, a former MEP and Labour peer, was extremely, it was abusive towards Rosie Duffield, a woman Labour MP, on the eve of the 8th anniversary of Joe Cox's death. And the Labour Party leadership has been completely silent on that. Michael Cashman should have had the whip withdrawn from him. I see today that his name is no longer on the list of Labour peers. He's still on the parliamentary list of Labour peers, but on the Labour Party list he's no longer there. But as far as I know, no one has said anything yet. And I think that's a failure of leadership. Cashman, it should be, he was abusive towards a female colleague.
Yeah, I did. I remember tweeting about that. I'm tired of people treating Rosie Duffield badly.
Well, I'm tired of Keir Starmer not having the courage to stand up towards bullies. And the second thing is, read Tony Blair's interview in Holyrood, and he made a very good point that no other profession, he's talking about an incoming Labour government, is somebody like, say, and I'm just picking West Streeton out because he's somebody like West Streeton is given a huge job to fix our broken National Health Service with one hand tied behind his back because he doesn't have enough cash.
Mhm.
And he has to change the culture of it. And he's got absolutely no experience of doing anything of that. And that's how politics works. But it does show, as Blair said, I became Prime Minister and I had absolutely no experience, no idea how to do this job. So I think as we're looking towards the Starmer government, then I think we need to remember that most of the people who are going to be running the country in 3 weeks' time,
That's a thought.
no experience in that.
How many of the Labour shadow cabinet have previous experience being a government minister? I didn't think about that. Because in Blair's time, we're not.
Yvette, I think, was a minister, wasn't she?
Yeah, Yvette Cooper.
Cabinet. But not very many. Yeah.
So there isn't actually that previous sort of muscle memory at all.
No, there isn't.
I hadn't thought of that. Because I remember Blair had the same problem, actually.
Well, yeah, that's why he was
who were old enough to remember 79. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting one, actually, yeah.
Anyway.
Andrew, final thoughts from you? Is there something you want to flag up?
Nothing specific. I mean, I think a great discussion as always. And I think it's interesting because I think even though the election campaign, as Susan, I think rightly said, has been quite dry and kind of lacking in enthusiasm, it still could be such a significant election for all the reasons we've kind of outlined. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that even though we're probably, hopefully, touch wood, keep everything crossed, heading for a more kind of stable, sensible government for a while, I don't think that means politics is going to be boring and stay. I think there's going to be a lot going on in terms of what happens to the Conservative Party, what happens in Scotland, obviously looking towards 2026. So I think it's, I think there'll be plenty to pick over over the next few months and years, indeed.
Indeed. We'll have plenty to talk about. And of course, in the future, we should really, of course, talk about Sir Davy. We never had the chance. Today, but he's actually had a very impressive time. I thought he would have had a real nightmare of an election with the post office scandal, but he has been this fun guy falling into water whenever he can, and at the same time did a really very marvelous personal TV slot about his personal experiences of his parents' deaths and being a carer for his son. Ed Davies actually impressed me a great deal, as he's really enjoyed this election and come into his own. But we can talk about Lib Dems again in the future. I always forget about the Lib Dems.
Well, and he forgot, conveniently, the other day when he was talking about the impact of austerity over the last, and then he stopped and went, the last few years. Could not admit that between 2010 and 2015, his party were equally as culpable as the Conservatives for introducing austerity.
That coalition is still is an albatross that escaped yet. Well, anyway, I enjoyed it, and I hope our listeners will have enjoyed it as well. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. See you soon.